All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our legislative wrap-up webinar. What an exciting end of session, and thank you for joining us today. As we reflect on this past year, we've really been able to witness extraordinary changes in the education landscape, whether that be from the pandemic's ongoing impact to pretty significant shifts in education funding. These challenges, plus many more in between, make advocacy even that much more crucial. So I first want to start by thanking you and sharing my deepest appreciation to those that have been involved and taken action when called upon that has allowed us to be even more effective in our advocacy efforts. And if you're just thinking about being involved and just beginning to be curious about how your advocacy and your support help in those efforts, please continue to reach out and to be involved again if you have not yet. The efforts are not a one-time effort. They are vital and ongoing and enable us to proactively shape legislation, proactively address these challenges ahead of us. And with that, thanks for joining us today. I want to turn it over to Darrin Waters. He is the chair of our legislative committee, and he and the governmental relations team here will navigate you through some huge successes and massive efforts that have taken place to shift education. Darrin?
Tasha, thank you. Good morning, everybody. As Tasha said, I'm Darrin Waters. I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Business for Hemet Unified School District down in Riverside County, and I also serve as chair of the CASBO Legislative Committee. Joining me today are two members of CASBO's governmental relations team. I have Elizabeth Esquivel as the Assistant Executive Director of Governmental Relations, and Michelle Gill is Director of Policy and Advocacy. So we're going to be walking you through some stuff today. We'll talk about some local impacts and what that may look like to you at the local level as these things come on board. So I'll turn it over to the ladies. Next slide.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Darrin. I can just quickly run us through the agenda right now. We will be starting this webinar with end of session, then we'll be going to key legislation, then signed legislation, vetoed legislation, and then finally we'll be wrapping it up with looking ahead and what's coming next.
Next slide. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and start this off with our end of session. Just to put into context, the legislative session is 2 years. And so this is the first year of a 2-year session. And we did see an influx of measures that were introduced, 3,030 measures by the legislature. A third of the legislature is new, so I think that there was a lot of eagerness to start introducing ideas. Out of that 3,000, 1,326 were sent to the governor. And so I just want to make sure that people understand that bills that did stall this year can be revisited next year. So again, we are in the beginning of the first year of a 2-year session. So some of these bills will continue to move forward next year. And then just, I guess, very quickly too, session ended almost at midnight. They take a long time to talk through all of these measures, have a lot of discussions on bills that they're sending to the legislature. So this year they ended around midnight. When it came to the governor's action, the governor had until October 14th to act on bills. However, he decided this year that he was going to do it a day early and cleared the desk around 8 o'clock Friday, October 13th. So at this point, he has signed 1,170 bills and vetoed 156. So we see almost roughly a 12% veto rate, which is actually a little higher than what we have seen in the past.
Now we'll take a deeper look into our key legislation that CASBO has been working on. So right here are 11 bills that ended up on Governor Newsom's desk. Originally, we started this year with 30 bills that we had positions on, but throughout the process, some bills stalled, some bills became inactive bills, and some bills were incorporated into the budget also. But in the next few slides, we'll take a deeper look into signed and vetoed bills as well.
Yeah, and as we transition, I think it's important for everyone to know that it is our legislative committee that meets every month, and they take positions on the bills on behalf of the organization. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this first bill that got signed. And this is AB 579 by Assemblymember Ting that has to do with zero emission vehicles. This was a bill that was actually introduced last year and it stalled. So then it came back as a new bill, AB 579. And what the bill does is that it requires come January 1st, 2035, that all newly purchased or contracted school buses of an LEA to be zero emission vehicles. The bill does extend the requirement to frontier LEAs until January 1st, 2040, and it does allow them and authorizes them to apply for annual extensions to 2045. So I think the biggest difference between why this bill moved forward and got signed compared to last year is that last year's bill was 2030. So that would have made that requirement 5 years earlier. So we see when the bill got it reintroduced this year, that they delayed the implementation to 2035. I do want to note that we were not really surprised that he did sign this one this time around. In the spirit of addressing climate change, which is something that he's been very passionate about, the bill does also align with the executive order that he issued September 23rd, 2020, requiring all medium and heavy duty vehicles such as trucks and buses to be 100% zero emission vehicles by 2045. So it is in alignment with the actions that he has taken. The bill this year also provides that extension for the frontier schools. And as you can see on the slide, we have the definition for what that means. We did take an opposed position on this. There are a lot of concerns around just infrastructure, cost, and the concerns around the small and rural areas that have long routes. So these are not necessarily, they're not helpful in those school districts and in those areas. And the next part on this is that there is funding available. In 2022, the governor provided $1.5 billion in Proposition 98 for these purposes. However, this year in the 2023 budget, he ended up delaying that funding an extra year. So the funding is still there, but the funding is delayed. The funding got delayed to help avoid deeper cuts to the block grants that we had seen also got signed from last year. Another part of this is that the governor did provide a signing message. So when the governor vetoes bills, he needs to provide a reason and a rationale. So he does provide veto messages. It is very rare that he does signing messages. So in this case, he wanted to sign the bill, but he also wanted to make sure that there was a message out there. And that message is, in the future, as we get closer to that implementation date of 2035, I recommend and I encourage future legislators and administration to monitor the technology for these purposes. So I think that that's the caveat to this, is that he's saying, I'm signing it, the funding is there, it aligns with what my thoughts and my goals and my priorities are. However, I recognize that the technology may not necessarily be there. In the Senate Appropriations Committee analysis, they do state that full implementation over time would be $5.53 billion. So even though we have the $1.5 billion, clearly that still is not going to be enough in order to replace the entire fleet of school buses that we have here in the state.
Elizabeth, I'd like to add, this bill as presented, right, it had a lot of problems, which is why we opposed it. We all know, those of us that run transportation fleets and have electric vehicles know that it's not a one size fits all. We can't, I have my personal district. I'm at 650 square miles. I have a urban setting, and suburban setting where those buses work okay. But then I've also got a couple mountain communities that I cannot get those buses up to. So we know the technology is not there. I think this is in recognition with that late implementation date. And I think the governor actually even gave a little wiggle room with that. Governor's message is, as Elizabeth pointed out, that he's not sure the technology will be there either. And that $5.5 billion cost is a concern. And I think we also recognize too, the infrastructure is not there to support this. So it's a long implementation, and hopefully I'm retired by then, but I'll leave that for the younger folks to sort out as you come on.
And I will say that we did have a couple of our CASBO members meet with the author's office as well as with the sponsors of the bill, just so that they understand the concerns around the existing fleets and the issues that they're currently experiencing. So we made sure that the author's office knew this and the sponsors of the bill knew what we're experiencing right now with the current fleets. I also note that Assemblymember Ting is the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, which is why we were able to see the bill, reach the governor's desk and get signed.
Elizabeth, if I could just add one last thing. I know we're on time here, but the other question is manufacturing capacity. And one of the things we had talked about early on was there was not enough manufacturing capacity in the country to produce that many electric vehicles at this point in time as well. So that's another thing that we're gonna have to keep a close eye on is can industry even supply the buses even if the state were to fund this?
So this is a great one. Before I get into what the bill does, this idea actually came from one of our CASBO members. And what I really want to help emphasize is that there are opportunities for CASBO to sponsor legislation. I know that we have a lot of concerns around a lot of bills, but if there are any ideas, anything that will help make your jobs a little bit easier, please let us know. We definitely want to continue to be proactive rather than always just being reactive. So this is a really fun one that, again, one of our CASBO members brought forward. And so what the bill does is it authorizes school districts to post information about the proposed budgets online. So right now they're currently required to post them in the newspapers. The idea was like that this is so antiquated. Why do we have to do this? It costs money. And so the bill will come 2027 eliminate that requirement. Instead, they would have to post, schools will have to post this budget information on the school district website. And this bill was signed on October 13th. That we did, of course, we had a support position on this. And also very rarely do we see fiscal impacts actually show that there are potential cost savings to the state, specifically here for Proposition 98 in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually.
I'll give a shout out to Gary Stein. He is our immediate past chair of the CASBO Ledge Committee. And this was he works at Orange County Department of Ed. And as you know, we post those typically through our county offices. And he saw this as a great opportunity. So kudos to Gary. We did in Southern California, I don't know if you saw it in other parts of the state, but Southern California, we did have some editorials put in by the newspapers themselves, obviously seeing an erosion of their revenues by us not having to post this any longer. So there was a lot of opposition that we were seeing down here in the op-ed pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the negotiation was that this ideally this would have become law come January 1st, 2024. However, because of the negotiations of the concerns that the publishers had, there was a delay for this to not take place until 2027. Another fun part of this was Gary Stein, as you mentioned, Darrin, what was the lead witness helping testify in support of this bill in the legislature during our advocacy days. Great.
AB 897 by Assemblymember McCarty. Assemblymember McCarty is also the chair of Budget Sub-2 Committee in Assembly, which looks at education finance. This bill was introduced by him earlier this year, which is a kind of divided into two parts. Part A is it would give adult education teachers permanent status after the probationary period is over. And then part two is if an employee is hired using categorical funds, upon time of their hire, they would have to be notified about their tenure and also the source of their funding. CASBO, we brought this bill up to our legislative committee. We opposed this bill because of different reasons that also Darrin can share with you all. The bill was signed by Governor Newsom on October 8th. There are some fiscal impacts to it. We just don't know exactly how much because of the due process for the adult education teachers it'll be causing. So we just don't know the exact numbers, but we do know it'll be costing money from Prop 98 for that reason.
Yeah, and I think this goes into effect July 1st of 24. I think it's going to change the way we have to think about our adult ed a little bit, in that you're basically giving these people tenure. And we know that adult ed is very similar to our CTE programs, in that the demand changes over time. So it's kind of hard once you get given somebody job rights to tenure. If that subject is no longer needed, how do we pivot to provide those services to the community? So there's just going to be some extra work for us on that. The categorical component, I think, makes sense. I think a lot of us do it already. We let the candidate know that this is a categorically funded position. When the money dries up, the position dries up, kind of thing. But it's going to require us to be much more thorough in our communication to those employees.
Right. AB 452 on childhood sexual assault. This is always a really difficult item to work on. We do have an opposed position on this, and it's specifically on the fact that there are costs associated with these lawsuits. So it eliminates the statute of limitation for when people may file civil lawsuits seeking damages for assault cases against defendants, including state and local agencies. Part of that includes public schools. And so this bill was signed by, to no surprise, on October 10th. We don't know exactly what the costs are on these settlements and all these cases, but there is a case that took place earlier this year that's resulting in about $6.5 million. And so just something to be mindful of. I think when we had a conversation with the author's office, the bill was actually retrospective, and we were able to work with them to ensure that this is prospective come 2024. This is in alignment with the executive order that President Biden had. And as we took a closer look at the executive order, we had to mention to them the executive order is prospective, not retrospective. But again, we appreciate really working with the author's office for them to take that amendment really early on.
I'll not to one up you, Elizabeth, but we just had a settlement here in Riverside County of $135 million this last week. $135 million on some cases that happened back, I think it was in the 90s. We know that 218 really pushed that and made that very difficult for us to defend. And we know it set those dates. This one, the nice thing about this bill is it has an actual date going forward. So it is any case that happens after January 1st of 2024. What that's going to allow, I mean, it won't help us for the current year. There's still going to be some ambiguity in our pricing from our JPAs and carriers on our liability insurance for the 6 months until we get to the end of usually our periods run with the fiscal years of the school district. But they'll be able to start pricing that into our rates. So I'm fully anticipating, and I think you need to start planning for some jumps in those rates. I know we've seen some recently with 218, and I think that's going to continue as this goes forward.
AB 483 by Assamimra El-Muratsuchi. Assamimra El-Muratsuchi is also the chair of Education Committee in the Assembly. This bill will require the Department of Healthcare Services to establish and revise an audit process, just helping the schools and districts with the process of LEA's medical billing option program. Right now, they're just a really long process, so this will just help expedite schools and school districts getting the reimbursement back, especially for health services provided to students that are eligible for Medi-Cal. health, and insurance. And when we brought this bill up to our legislative committee, they really liked it, of course, supporting the bill. We were able to have discussions with the consultants for the committee as well. They were very, very pleased to have us support this bill. It was signed on October 8th by Governor Newsom. And just for the fiscal impact, it would be just state dollars from the general fund and also federal dollars.
I think the advantage here is I think there's been a lot of ambiguity at times on the audit process, at least for my experiences with this. And you know, a lot of us have put in policies where we don't actually spend the money until we've gotten past the audit periods because of the ambiguity. This kind of puts some certainty into it, really gives us some tight timelines so we can access those dollars sooner without having fear of it being pulled back at some point through an audit process. And they'll wind up having the settlement amounts to the LEAs within 12 months, audit completed within 18 months.
Here's probably another one that many people have been hearing of, SB 88 by Senator Skinner. To put into context, Senator Skinner is the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, so that comes with a lot of authority and a lot of power to be able to push legislation. And so this bill imposes new requirements on drivers who provide transportation services to students, including background checks and having the drivers be mandated reporters. It also requires the vehicle to that the student is in to be inspected and be equipped with a first aid kit and a fire extinguisher. The background and the context here is this bill did a lot more, and there was a lot of work with a lot of LEAs and a lot of the statewide organizations, a big collaboration and big partnership with many of us to be able to get some big amendments. And really clear here, we want to make sure that we state what those amendments were that helped all of us go neutral, and it removed the prohibition for the transportation network companies. It delayed the implementation to July 1st, 2025. I thought we were trying to get that pushed a little bit more, but we settled on 25. It expanded the driver exemptions and expanded the LEA employer exemption. We were able to remove minimum training hours and remove the mandated report requirement and soften. So, and then this is another piece that was part of the amendments, but wasn't part of our negotiations. But Senator Skinner is a little bit more leaning towards how to soften the drug and alcohol testing as it pertains to marijuana. So that we might see an overhaul of as she continues to stay in her role, in her position. The bill was signed on October 7th.
And this bill, we did a lot of lobbying on this, and we were able to get a lot of good changes in. I think that by a large group of people that joined CASBO as well. It was really going after the app-based companies, or what they call transportation network companies, that we use for ones and twos, and trying to get, and really it was more of a labor-driven law, in that they wanted to try to regulate that a little bit first to get for their, obviously for their members to be, or increase their membership. No longer. It is originally written and applied to coaches. I saw a question in the chat about, did it include the vans for student activities? It did, and we were able to get that part taken out. But there are some requirements on those drivers, and those of us that have high schools, and we know the difficulty of trying to get on campus or even walk on coaches right now is very difficult. And if you put another barrier in there of additional trainings, it's going to make it more difficult, even more difficult. The original bill, I believe it was 10 hours of training it required. They've taken out the time requirement and given a couple of skill things that need to happen. And there does need to be a medical exam every 2 years. That'll be maintained at the district level, not the DMV. So in 2025, we're going to need to start figuring out how we deal with that. And it will have them have to adhere to the same driving hour standards as our current bus drivers, which is no more than 10 hours in a day driving, and no more than 16 hours from the start of their duty to after 8 hours off. So once they've come on, their clock starts and they got 16 hours to get back and forth. Now it's going to be a challenge for some of us. We have athletic programs and may have to travel a great distance, teacher taught all day. they jump in the van, they take the kids to the contest, stopping at dinner or whatever, and then making it back in 16 hours. This is something, and one more thing we'll have to watch on this.
Yeah, just one more thing on this. When you get the PowerPoint presentation, you can go ahead and click on the link to SB 88 and it'll take you straight to the language, but there's a long list of exemptions and we had to work really, really hard on that. We wanted to make sure that there were not going to be any unintended consequences, especially for our most at-promise youth that are being served by the county offices of education. So as much as we were trying to narrow the scope of the bill some more, part of the negotiation was, nope, not going to get rid of this. Instead, let me know which exemptions you need. So you'll see a list of that.
SB 326, another neutral bill that CASBO has a neutral position on. This bill is actually just changing the Mental Health Services Act to Behavioral Health Services Act to incorporate substance abuse disorder conditions. It also modifies the funding buckets a bit. So funding buckets would be 30% would be going towards housing, 35% would be for mental health services, and the next 35% would be also going towards the behavioral health services. This will be also a ballot measure that will be seen on March elections. So, voters will be able to see it and vote on it. It's also coupled with another bill, which is Assembly, and that also provides housing for anyone going through homelessness and for anyone having really hard struggles with mental health too.
All right, another one, SB 765. This is being able to bring back retirees. And so this is an idea that was also vetted by our legislative committee and became a budget priority when we met last October. We weren't able to see that in the budget. However, we were grateful that Senator Portantino decided to carry this bill. And so, as you know, the executive order that took place back in 2020 during COVID, we wanted to continue to see that extension. And so that's what this bill does. It extends in temporary increases the post-retirement compensation earnings limit for a retired educator to be able to come back. So it'll extend that until June 30th, 2026. So this bill did get signed on the last day, October 13th. Another part of the fiscal impact here is that it does acknowledge that there can be a cost savings in the short term to the extent hiring and paying retired educators is less expensive than hiring permanent educators, but it does also provide the implications for what this means for the increases it shares for CalSTAR's cost. We were very happy and grateful to have seen this move forward.
And currently the earnings limit is based on 50% of the median earnings from the prior year, and it's going to basically increase that to 70%. And it's pointed out here, it's just a 2-year stretch for us, but this should help us as we continue to struggle filling some positions within our districts.
All right, so we'll go ahead and transition over to legislation that was vetoed. The big thing that really stands out here in a handful of these veto messages is the governors continue to send a consistent message. He mentions that the legislature sent him nearly $19 billion of unaccounted cost, of which $11 billion would be ongoing. And so he does recognize that our fiscal revenues are not where they need to be. And so we must remain disciplined when deciding on which bills to sign, and that we're not incorporated in the budget or don't have a funding mechanism to them. He is proud that in partnership with the legislature, when they finished and finalized the budget, that they were able to close $30 billion shortfall. He is proud that they were able to avoid making cuts to key key programs and be able to protect education, healthcare, climate, public safety, without having to dip into any of the reserves, or without cutting those specific services. So I think he wants to continue to be a fiscal steward when it comes to the bills that he ended up vetoing, with providing this consistent message. And he did something similar last year too, where he kept referencing the legislature sending me this much money, that much of that is ongoing, and there's nothing accounted for those bills.
So we did also work on call to actions. Call to actions, you can see an example right here. It's usually emailed to our members. You fill in information, it'll go to your legislator. So we did send 3 emails or call to actions to our legislators, urging them to vote no on AB 1699, urging them to vote no on AB 579, and then urging them to vote yes on AB 721. And then we also, towards the end of session, sent calls to action to Governor Newsom. And for him, I made an ask to vote no on AB 1699 and veto AB 579, and veto AB 1699 also. Altogether, we were able to send more than 1,000 calls to action. So thank you everyone who participated in those. It really made a difference. Tasha was also in a meeting with the governor's office, and they did tell her that this definitely made an impact. So again, thank you so much for participating. And this truly shows that advocacy matters and every single voice matters. So just leading from the vetoes, let's dive into AB 1699 by Samira McCarty, K through 14 classified employees, part-time and full-time vacancies. So we just had a lot of issues with this bill to begin with. I can't dive into what this bill did. It would offer classified employees, whether they were part-time or full-time, any job openings 10 days prior to opening them to external candidates. It would also just have them meet the basic bare minimum requirements before their start date, not even before their hire date or anything, whether they were best suited for this job or if they were the most qualified candidate, and it would just be based on seniority. So obviously, CASBO saw a lot of issues with this bill. We opposed this bill through and through. There were amendments taken on this bill, but we just could not get there. And Darrin, please, you being the chair of legislative committee, we've had robust conversations. We also had conversations with the governor's office, with the consultants, with legislators, and we also had a really good 4 statewide school management organizations coalition that was really strong. And we do thank them also. We thank our members for getting us to this result. But Darrin, please help us understand more about why this bill was such a big issue.
Sure. So this was in a year of 3,000 bills that were sent or written, submitted. This is in the list near the top of the list of some of the worst bills I think that were put there. I think editorializing a little bit, if I may. Sometimes if you think 3,000 bills are necessary, it might be a good justification for a part-time legislature instead of a full-time legislature, like many other states have. But really, I think anytime we're looking at promotions based on seniority basis than on performance or qualifications, there's a problem. And that's, in essence, in a nutshell, that's what this bill did. The author was trying to help us with our hiring woes. It was clearly a labor-driven bill. So we were unsuccessful in stopping it coming out of the different houses. But we had a little bit of traction with the governor, and I'm going to be honest, I thought he was going to sign this bill, so I was very actually pleasantly surprised that he did not. So I think that's a good win for education.
And I just want to add that at 3:30, the Friday before the bill was signed, the 4 education management groups, AXA, CSBA, county superintendents, and ourselves met with the governor's office. And 2 kind of funny things from that meeting. First, they did not want to repeat everything that they had already heard. So it was a little bit of our final push to add emphasis where we could. we brought up some of the challenges, just the really practical challenges of implementation, changing HR systems that touch everyone, in such a reactive manner. But two things were funny. One, they said, yeah, we have a long weekend ahead and we'd like to get to our other work because we have such a volume of input from all of you on this particular bill. So that was kind of interesting. When we talked about those implementation challenges, I said, something like this, a system that touches everything in everyone in HR really has to have flawless execution when you're talking about that emotional moment of a promotion, right? And things like that. And they kind of laughed and said, Ms. Davenport is probably not aware that flawless execution does not typically happen at the state. So kind of gave us a chuckle, but we were pretty excited to see this one and the results that we had on this.
Yes, and just lastly, Governor's veto message was very aligned with the discussions that we had. That this bill just has so many consequences. So here's also an example of what a veto message looks like and the actual veto message also. So all of those discussions and conversations, the governor's office definitely listened and understood about where we're coming from. And we can see that in the veto message.
And I think we spent a little bit of time on this just so that people understood that this was how all the implications that this bill would have had on the school districts and on the LEAs, but also recognizing that this bill was a priority for our labor partners, and we anticipate the bill coming back next year. Assemblymember McCarty is now no longer going to be here. He's not running for a re-election. So it'll be interesting to see who the author will be, but we wanted to make sure that we spent a lot of time on this, just appreciating the efforts for getting this bill signed. But we do anticipate some sort of form of this bill come back next year.
SB 433 by Senator Cortese, classified school and community colleges employees disciplinary hearings. This was another CASBO opposed priority bill. So this bill would just extend the due process if a classified employee is at fault and they can request a third-party hearing officer. This would just cost the employers thousands of dollars, ranging from $30,000 from anywhere to $50,000. And even though if they know they're at fault, they can just get paid during this whole process while just waiting for a third-party officer to come in and make the decision. Of course, CASBO opposed it, and we're really happy to see that it was vetoed also. Just like how Darrin said he was surprised to see 1699 be vetoed, we were actually surprised to see this one be vetoed because it was liked by everyone in the legislature. But when we saw this, we were really happy and surprised. And also the veto message is really aligned with what we had been discussing with the governor's office and with the consultants in the legislature also.
And you're right on. This is another one of those, if I put the top 10 bad bills for the year, this would certainly be one of them that I would have put in there. Really what this was doing was taking authority away from our boards. And it was giving another level of appeal to classified employees. This actually exists on the certificated side. Those of us that have taken a certificated employee all the way to termination, there is another step that this is kind of shaped after. And I don't having been through that and actually having somebody kick back to us through that process, it's not all that great because your board and your community lose control over who we're putting in those spots. So this is another good veto. I was very pleased to see.
AB 249 on lead testing water. So interesting on this one is that we had conversations on this with other organizations, including CASH, including AXA, LAUSD. We were all in partnership with having conversations with the author's office. So this one we have an opposed unless amended position. We understand that no one wants to have lead in their water at school sites. And so there have been a bill in the past to try to help address that. And then we saw this one be introduced this year. So this bill would have required on or before January 1st, 2027 to have a community water system test for lead in each of the school sites for potable water system outlets. They would then need to report those results to the state water board. And then if there was anything there, they would have to then report that to the specific LEA or that school site if the lead levels would have exceeded 5 parts per billion. If it did, then they would have to perform specified actions in order to help rectify the problem. And so this really puts the authority on the community water system. When we did have conversations with the author's office, they did end up narrowing the scope of the bill so that it's just for Title I schools. However, I think with our members, there was a concern around, well, you can't just test one school site and not test the other. There's an equity issue there. So we brought that concern forward. So we appreciate that they were trying to narrow the scope of the bill so that there could be enough funds available for this, but there was still a lot of questions and concerns around the funding just still not being there. The governor did end up vetoing this bill on October 8th. I was surprised. I would have been surprised if he would have vetoed it, or I was expecting for him to sign it. Interesting enough with this bill, the administration did give the author's office proposed amendments. So instead of making it a requirement, it would have continued to have, it would have had this be a grant program. And so we were anticipating the bill coming out of the Appropriations Committee with these amendments so that it changed from the requirement to that grant program. The bill did not change and maintained the requirement language. And when we met with the governor's office, I think it was pretty clear that they were not happy that these amendments were not taken. And so that to us indicated, okay, that gives them an opportunity to veto the bill. Here are some proposed amendments to make it into a grant program rather than a requirement. You're not going to take them. There's going to be a veto message coming. What I will say is that there was $25 million that was provided in this year's budget for these purposes, but we know that that wasn't going to be enough. The estimated cost to replace just a single fixture can range from $300 to $1,700. And so he does reckon, and right now we know that we have a backup in our facility. I mean, we're backed up in our school state facilities program. It's exhausted. It exceeds $8 billion. So in a time where we're barely able to scrape by, we know that there isn't enough funding available here. We did try to provide proposed amendments in terms of, again, narrowing the scope of the bill, trying to do a phased-in approach, but those amendments were not taken on our end. So we try to work very diligently with them on this. But just happy to see that the bill did end up getting vetoed.
And I would echo Elizabeth's comments and say, it's kind of alarming that it's okay to have lead in the pipes of non-Title I schools, which is kind of the inverse of what they're talking about here. I think the uniqueness of this one, because we've gone through some of this testing in the past. We did samples of sites. This was going to require every single water faucet, drinking fountain, sink in every site to be tested, and the cost of that was going to be pretty obviously significant. And really, do we need to test, even though it's a Title I school, if it's a brand new school, does that need to be tested? I mean, there's a lot of questions there on how that would go, but as you can imagine, the cost increases are going to be very, very significant on this issue.
Yeah, and the big part of his veto message was, how are you supposed to, what's the database for tracking this compliance? So that was going to be a big issue for the administration on that front. All right. So what we want to make sure that people understand too, again, stalled legislation. We were successful in some bills that we opposed that became 2-year bills, and then some bills that we supported have also become 2-year bills. So again, because they are stalled, it just means they didn't make it to the governor's office this year, but we do anticipate these bills moving forward come next year. So the two that I'll bring up real quick are AB 247 by Assemblymember Maritucci, SB 28 by Senator Glazer. These are the two facility bills that we're seeing. The Glazer bill is $15.5 billion, but it includes higher education. Maritucci's bills between $14 and $15 billion. That includes transitional kindergarten through community college. There was just a lot of conversations around when are we going to try to have this bond be put on the ballot, and trying to understand what Governor Newsom's priorities are. We learned that he was going to have his mental health bond priorities come March. And so that made the decision for both Glazer and Maritucci's office to say, all right, well, if we're not going to get this on the March ballot, it's going to go on the November ballot, but we need to sit down and we have to have a conversation. There is a discrepancy between higher education and just the TK through 12 through community college. So they're going to need to figure out, as the authors of the bill, how they want to proceed, should they want to see something on the November ballot. I think it's important to note that in the past, we did have Proposition 13 that did get put on the ballot and it did not pass. The governor was very supportive of that. We're not seeing that same type of support this time around. And I think that there's thought around whether or not we should put a bond on the ballot and have the state go into debt, given our economic situation. So we'll continue to try to push for that, and we'll leave it up to the voters come November, but there'll continue to be a conversation around these two bills and whether or not higher education will be incorporated. The next one,
Elizabeth, if I could just chime in on
Yeah.
those two real quick. Just to emphasize, I did see it in the chat there being stalled. It is intended that this will be on the November 24 ballot. One of these will be, or some variation thereof. Just a couple things. She talked about it being TK-14 versus the preschool and all the way through college. We know colleges, and that's the Glazer bill. The Glazer bill goes through higher ed, and we know that doesn't poll well with voters. So there's a concern about having that in the ballot language, having that higher ed stuff. Senate Bill 28 is very similar to Prop 13 that was defeated back in whatever year that was now. It does include the higher ed. Both of them do have a sliding scale though. So if you're in a low assessed valuation per pupil, you get priority points. And then the AB 247 also has priority points based if you're a high UPP district or not. Right now, it looks like in the language that's written, Glazer's at about $15.5 billion. Maritucci's bill is at $14 billion, but it doesn't break out how those are going to be spent just yet.
Thank you on that. SB 499, this would have created a school extreme heat action plan. It would have required a plan for every school site and then have that plan be implemented come 2027. There's just a lot of conversations around how do we help mitigate some of the black concrete that we're seeing and climate change. So we did see an influx of facility bills be introduced. This one there was a lot of concerns around the practicality of addressing this, and so the bill did stall. We'll see if the author decides to continue moving forward with it. And then I'll turn it over to you, Darrin, for AB 938 and SB 98.
Sure. On on 499, I think it was kind of interesting in the language there. It's stalled, so we'll probably see it again. It's talking about using cool pavement technologies, wood chips and the like for different landscaping pieces, and getting rid of the asphalt and concrete. And it was kind of interesting because they're talking about they want us to put in more ornamental grass that we all just ripped out because of drought. So it's kind of interesting that this bill kind of counters that a little bit on the drought side. So I think it's something that's going to have to be reconciled next year in this next session. On 938 for the education finance. So this was it was a little bit more than aspirational, and some of Maritucci's LCFF changes were aspirational, but this was to increase salaries by 50%. And it didn't take really into account where you were at. It just said we're going to increase everybody's salaries by 50% by a certain year. I think it was 30. Oh, I'm going to screw that up. I think it's 30, somewhere in the low, maybe 31 or 32. They would achieve that. But it only changes the target, not the actual entitlement. So it's going to create another gap scenario that we went through as we wrapped up to full implementation of the LCFF. So we'll see more on that as to come. That's going to be a very expensive proposition to stomach for the legislature. Senate Bill 98 from Portantino, and Portantino, for those of you, just as a reminder, Senator Portantino is the one that brought us the late start bill for our secondary schools. He's proposing funding on an enrollment basis versus ADA basis. On the surface, CASBO is very amenable, and I think most of us would agree that, hey, funding us on how we're what our enrollment is, not on the ADA, would certainly help. There's a lot of concern in the legislature that we would no longer track ADA, or we wouldn't chase kids for chronic absenteeism. I've explained, as long as it's on our dashboard, we're all going to be chasing that down anyways, and it just makes sense to have our kids in school. So ultimately, we support the concept. The problem with this bill, though, that I testified on this bill in Sacramento, is that 30% of the difference. So if you look at what you're entitled for ADA versus your enrollment, 30% of that delta would have to be spent solving chronic absenteeism. So in hiring people, it was to hire, again, it was a nod to labor, hire some folks to track down your chronic absentee students, without any understanding or reconciliation. What if I don't have a chronic absentee problem? What if I don't need to spend 30%, but I could do it with 10? It was a requirement of 30%. And anytime you have that one size fits all, I think a lot of us have a lot of problems with that. Next slide.
So yeah, before we move on to the next slide, I just, and I know we're going to be crunched on time here, but I really want to emphasize our legislative committee and our opportunity to have met with the Assembly Education Committee consultants on the concerns around AB 938. So there were a handful of amendments that were taken, including excluding basic aid districts from this language. And to your point, this is intent language on the reference to the 50%, but we also understand how problematic that can be politically at the local level. And the assembly member had actually committed to removing the reference to the 50% in his language of the bill. That was stated in the Assembly Education Committee. When we expressed our concerns, we were excited to see that the reference to the 50% was going to be deleted. And it did in all places except for the main part. And so in the end, the assembly member decided to change their mind and keep that reference to that 50%. But there were efforts from our legislative committee to at least get other amendments that were taken early on.
So now moving forward, we can just go to looking ahead. I can do a quick wrap up about how the legislature is. This year, we had nearly 1/3 of new assembly members and senators. We had 20 new assembly members and 10 new senators. Senate is made up of 40 senators and Assembly is made up of 80 assembly members. For next year, next year is a big election year. We're looking at about 30 new members coming in, which means there will be 30 open seats. Another exciting thing is that Senate Assemblymember McCarty is running for the mayor of Sacramento. So we will be seeing a change in our sub-2 committee for education and finance, new chairmanship over there. So we're ready to see how this committee will be taking place in the next years. Leadership changes also happened this year. This year started with Speaker Anthony Rendon. He was a speaker since 2016, third longest serving speaker of the assembly in California. But later on, it transitioned to Speaker Robert Rivas. He took speakership in late July, early August. And then same things are happening in Senate also. Leadership changes will be taking place next year. We just don't know exactly when, but we do know it is 2024. Currently, it is Senator Atkins, who is the Senator Pro Tem of Senate. She is the first woman and also an openly gay person to be in this role. And she has been the Pro Tem since 2018 when Kevin DeLeon left. New Pro Tem will be Senator McGuire. It has been announced. Again, we just don't know exactly when he will be taking this new role. And he has been in Senate since 2014, so a lot of experience there. And he has also been the chair of Senate Democratic Caucus since 2022.
And I think the important piece here that we wanted to provide is that with these leadership changes come a whole changes in committee chairs too. So we're going to see a lot of movement. We started seeing some of that movement already. So we'll continue to keep an eye out on what changes take place in the committees that we work with. And education, we do a lot of we cover a broad spectrum. So we're in labor committee, we're in insurance committee, we're in public employers committee. And so we'll see how the changes in leadership affect the chairmanship of the committees that we work with. And so just a quick revenue and state budget outlook. As of Friday, October 13th, the Franchise Tax Board month-to-date collections were $5.37 billion, and the state budget projections for the entire month of October anticipates collections of nearly $45 billion. So it does typically take several days after tax day for electronic and other payments to be processed. And then once that took place on Monday, October 15th was technically the deadline, but then it was on Monday. And then that same day, we find out that the IRS decides to postpone the tax filing and tax payment deadline all the way to November 16th. So extending it another month. 55 of California's 58 counties are incorporated in that. So unless you're Lassen, Modoc, or Shasta, that deadline will get extended until November 16th.
And Elizabeth, just to add, checking the number today, it's gone up to just right around a little over 10 billion that's been received. Still a far cry from the 44.9 billion, but we are seeing a little uptick. I just don't think it's enough yet that they're going to be able to reach that goal.
Here, we just wanted to make sure to provide you with the updated numbers from what we last have on the Department of Finance bulletin. They have not come out with their September bulletin yet, so this is a reflection of the August one. And then wanted to provide that in comparison with the Legislative Analyst Office. Their current forecast reflects lower decline in revenues in years 2022, 2023, and then 2023, 24. So they do understand that the risk remains as slowdown indicators persist, and that a deficit is still forecasted for 2024, 2025.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'd like to first of all thank Elizabeth and Michelle for all the work they've done, and Tasha for helping lead that as well. CASBO is definitely at the forefront of advocating for the needs of our public school systems. One last push to throw out there: if you are interested in advocacy at the local level and helping out, we have our advocacy network. I encourage you to take a look at that, to join. And you can do some local advocacy. I think the best advocacy we have is when we're doing it at our local, within our districts, with the representatives that represent our communities. So keep that in mind. And with that, I thank everybody for attending today. And I hope, I believe, ladies, correct if I'm wrong, but there's a recording. They'll get the slide deck as well, correct? Fantastic. All right. Well, with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you so much for your time today. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.